A young man lives in terror.
I thought vampires were after me.
A mother is so distracted she can no longer care for her own daughter.
I went into flashes of thinking that I was in a nuclear war.
A child is ferociously depressed.
Tried to commit suicide 3 times.
They are the severely mentally ill. Millions of Americans, vulnerable, sick. They are less likely to end up in a hospital than here. Welcome to the new dumping ground of choice for the mentally ill, your local jail. Tonight, we will document how hundreds of thousands of your neighbors are ending up behind bars. In jail, the sick are too often ignored. Held by untrained corrections officers, punished for behavior they cannot control.
It does seem that there is excessive force being used.
This is where they used to go. The original institution was called Bedlam, and it came to symbolize all the grim institutions that were finally exposed as snake pits.
Many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because of lack of attention.
One by one, the large institutions were shut down. But the community care we promised the mentally ill never materialized.
I said, I love my son. Please don't take custody of my son just because he needs treatment.
2 million severely mentally ill Americans receive no ongoing medical treatment. Their unpredictable, sometimes violent behavior puts at risk their families.
He would walk by me and say, it's time for you to die.
Themselves.
When did you do that?
That was multiple occasions.
And all of us. Remember the deadly shootings on Capitol Hill?
2 police officers are dead, a tourist and the gunman wounded.
The shooter, a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic getting no treatment.
They released him from the hospital and waved goodbye. Nobody made sure that he got his medication.
The mentally ill are trapped in today's terrible limbo, caught between good intentions and broken promises.
Can we honestly say that this is the best we can do for our most vulnerable citizens?
Tonight we'll search for answers. How to stop making criminals of the sick. What can we do to keep the mentally ill from going back to Bedlam? Sick people receiving no medical care, the symptoms of their disease landing them behind bars. Doesn't that sound like something that could not happen in modern America? Good evening, everybody. I'm Geraldo Rivera. If your disease is mental illness, you may not receive appropriate medical care. You may become confused, disoriented, and find yourself locked up in jail. Last year, that happened to almost 1 million Americans. Some of them could have been your neighbors or members of your own family. For most of her life, Cheryl Tarver showed no signs of mental illness. The first few years of her marriage to Roland Tarver, an oil rig worker, were happy and uneventful.
Jessica.
But one day when their daughter Jessica was just a baby, Roland realized something had gone terribly wrong.
I ended up finding her in the closet with Jessica with a butcher knife. I mean, held up like this. And she was looking around, you know, like she was looking for somebody.
A few days later, Cheryl was even more paranoid. Roland managed to coax her into the car.
She was screaming, crying, hallucinating.
I went into flashes of thinking that I was in a nuclear war, which was totally absurd.
Every once in a while, she'd look up in the sky because she thought my dad was after her in an airplane.
I grabbed Jessica and jumped over the back seat and grabbed her real close to me like I was protecting her from some kind of bomb that was getting ready to hit us.
Roland took Cheryl to an emergency room. The diagnosis was serious. Major depression with psychosis. Like 44 million other Americans, the family had no medical insurance. Roland says 12 days later, he met with a hospital administrator.
She tells me, well, Miss Tarvey, you owe like $16,000 some odd dollars. When the hospital found out that I couldn't pay the bill, she was out of the hospital the next day.
With no treatment, Cheryl could not hold on to her sanity.
There would be some days that she was fine, but then it was like the trigger to a gun. I mean, it was like just, you know, she would instantly change.
Roland insisted they separate, and he got custody of Jessica.
My hopes is she can get better. She can get better. And at least can visit her sometimes.
Desperate to see her daughter, Cheryl showed up one day without warning.
And I'm like, Roland, I want to see Jessica. I really want to spend some time with Jessica. Please, can I spend some time with Jessica today?
Roland had Cheryl arrested on trespassing charges. After 2 weeks in jail, Cheryl was homeless, drifting from town to town. Within a few months, she was back in trouble and back in jail, this time in Phoenix.
I plead guilty, I am insane, for I went out to play in the rain. And I ran off with my boyfriend's truck and drove it through the sand till I got it stuck.
Cheryl was placed on the psychiatric unit, where the sickest inmates are housed. The ones haunted by voices no one else can hear. The depressed, the paranoid, the delusional. There are more than 300,000 mentally ill Americans in jails and prisons on any given day, far more than in psychiatric hospitals.
I need the medication. I'm just scared of him. I'm scared of myself, too.
Treatment behind bars is minimal. Drugs are dispensed, but little else.
Have the jails become the institution of last resort, or indeed the institution of first resort for too many mentally ill?
Unfortunately, it's more like first resort.
Few people know more about the incarcerated mentally ill than psychiatrist Eve Fullatori, a leading expert on schizophrenia, who has worked in and out of jails for over 30 years. Tori recently wrote an acclaimed book about America's mental illness crisis.
If these people had tuberculosis or multiple sclerosis, everyone would be up in arms.
Like those diseases, the roots of mental illness are biological.
The area of the brain that we think is most involved in schizophrenia and manic depression is this area right down in here. It's just that most people don't understand that schizophrenia and manic depression are brain disorders. And the fact that we are failing these people as badly as we are failing them, I think is a total disgrace.
A shame and a disgrace. That's what Life magazine called American mental hospitals in 1946. Back then, most patients were committed against their will into places the article described as little more than concentration camps.
The abandonment of the mentally ill and the mentally retarded to the grim mercy of custodial institutions too often inflicts on them and their families a needless cruelty.
The calls for reform were fueled by the discovery of new medications and the idealistic hope that with supervision in the community, the mentally ill could live on their own. Until the early 70s, the mentally retarded were also warehoused, as I found out at Willowbrook, where more than 5,000 retarded children and adults were locked away in overcrowded, understaffed, filthy conditions.
The doctor had warned me that it would be bad. It was horrible.
Calls for deinstitutionalization, that's getting the mentally disabled out of the institutions and into community treatment, became unstoppable. So for people like Cheryl Tarver, a state hospital was no longer an option. In a generation, 9 out of 10 state hospital beds have been eliminated. But while hospitals were being closed, community care was not being opened.
We didn't provide the services once people left the hospital. We simply kind of waved goodbye.
Mental illness is more common than most people realize. 5 million Americans are seriously mentally ill. Almost half, like Cheryl, received no treatment. 150,000 of them are homeless.
Well, most of these people need to be on medication. Many of them don't realize they need medication. These are the ones who have ended up on the streets. These are the ones who've ended up in jail.
I would get delusional. I'd see monsters, demons.
Roger Gams is a schizophrenic. Like Cheryl Tarver, mental illness landed him behind bars. Ever since he was a child growing up in San Luis Obispo, California, Roger has been plagued by enemies only he can see and hear.
One time, I took apart a radio. I was trying to find the creature,
in the radio that I believed was speaking to me.
In his worst psychotic states, it could be very scary to have him around.
Roger's mother, a professional musician, and his father, a college professor, reached out to the county mental health department for help. They say they got some astonishing advice. Make your mentally ill son homeless.
They were assuming he'd go in and out of jail, and then somebody would hospitalize him and he would stabilize.
The mental health professional said the criminal justice system would do what they could not, force Roger into treatment. With no other options, his parents reluctantly put Roger on the street.
He got much, much worse, and he got really, really physically ill. And I thought, oh my God, that's my child, and I can't do anything for him.
That's the craziest I've ever been. I was going to jail a lot back then, getting locked up for misdemeanor offenses, and I was also getting committed.
Committed repeatedly here at the county hospital and released in just 3 days, as sick as ever.
I pretty much felt maybe a little bit more rested, but I was still crazy.
3 days is California's legal limit for holding a patient not deemed a threat to himself or others or gravely ill. Roger's mother, Ray Bell, knew her homeless son was gravely ill, but she could not convince authorities.
Gravely ill, living on the street, you're not gravely ill because you're able to eat out of garbage cans, so you're feeding yourself. And he also is not a danger to himself, even though he threatens suicide sometimes. There's no blood dripping on the floor. And he's not a danger to someone else because there was no hole in me, no blood.
We've come a long way from the days when all it took to get someone confined to a mental institution was a couple of anonymous phone calls. Maybe we've gone too far. These days, not even the threat of violence is enough. Many critics of the system say you can't get a mentally ill person confined nowadays unless they actually hurt themselves or try to kill somebody, or maybe even succeed. Most mentally ill people are not violent, but when untreated, a significant few are, and their irrational acts can sometimes scar a nation. Consider that shooting on Capitol Hill. 2 police officers killed, 1 bystander wounded. The shooter was Russell Weston, a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic who, after a few weeks in the hospital, had been released with some pills and no follow-up.
Mr. Weston represents the large number of people with schizophrenia who don't know they're sick.
Is it their families who are at gravest risk?
Certainly the families are a large risk.
Despite the risk, Roger's mother could no longer bear to see him on the street, and she let him come home to a trailer in the backyard. There he would use street drugs and become more psychotic than ever.
When he'd get mad at me, he'd tell me he would chop my head off and that would solve the problem. And then he would walk by me and say, it's time for you to die.
That possibility seemed all too real the day Roger jimmied open his father's closet and helped himself to 2 shotguns and ammunition.
I stole the shotguns from my dad as an attempt to protect myself from the sea creatures and the vampires.
Roger's parents were now more determined than ever to get him into extended treatment. But in California, it is virtually impossible to have someone committed to a state hospital unless he is convicted of a serious crime.
The state mandates treatment for felons who are mentally ill. And I thought that was our only hope.
So his parents pressed felony charges against Roger, even though he returned their guns and had hurt no one. It was a tremendous risk. Their sick son could end up in state prison instead of a hospital.
Our lawyer went in every time Roger had a court date and said, this man has schizophrenia, he needs treatment.
Finally, the judge was convinced. Roger was sent to a maximum security hospital for the criminally insane, made a felon by his own parents for being mentally ill.
It was one of the hardest things that I've ever had to do. It broke my heart.
Next, what can happen to the mentally ill in jail? Places meant for punishment, not treatment.